The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield. I'm here as always with my co-host John Cuna. Today we're excited to have Dr. Owen Muir on as a guest. And so I'll give a quick bio. Dr. Owen Muir, also at Owen Muir MD on Twitter, that's M-U-I-R, is a psychiatrist based out of New York and of course in Metaverse, where he's very ever present, who co-founded Brooklyn Minds, where he oversees the Breaking Deep Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation Program, or DTMS, which we're going to talk about a little bit. Dr. Owen is also one of only 5 official supervisors in America for mentalization-based treatment, or MBT, and is co-editor of the book Adolescent Suicide and Self-Injury, a mentalization-based treatment approach. He's been on many podcasts and is very well known from his presence on Clubhouse as well. And is also the principal investigator at MindMed, where they focus on psychedelic-inspired medicines and experiential therapies. So, Dr. Owen, obviously, I had to consider your bio. You have quite a few things in there. So, I don't want to, gyp you of all the stuff you've accomplished. I want to keep it relatively short. But just for people listening, there's about 10 times that amount of stuff that we could have put into the bio. Dr. Owen has done quite a bit. And welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. I've started working on the selected references version of the CV, because once you get to like 200 academic citations, you're like, nobody wants to look at that. The short version is like, take the things you're interested in if you happen to be in academics, and give presentations on them in academic settings, and boom, suddenly you're the expert at talking about psychiatry on Twitter Spaces.
There you go. Yeah. It's great, and we'd like to start with MindMed. I know that's where the bio, I kind of ended the bio there with the MindMed piece. I'd love to start with that, because you just give a little backstory to listeners. We actually connected through the Psychedelics Anonymous community, which is an NFT community. I think a lot of people who aren't into NFTs might think Psychedelics Anonymous, what is that? And might think it's something like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. It is not. It is an NFT community, and more importantly, it's a business, right? Psychedelics Anonymous is an NFT business. And they have a lot of goals, right? They are, in large part going to be a metaverse and in real life brand. They have a lot of mental health goals in the space in terms of possibly creating an infrastructure for mental health in the metaverse. And a huge part of their mission is to, help support and further research and the use of psychedelics in assisted therapy, or psychedelic assisted therapy. And I know for you, MindMed is sort of also in that landscape. So I'd love to just get a background from you of what MindMed is and what you guys focus on.
So Mind Medicine Incorporated, which is not the same as Mind Medicine Australia, is the first publicly traded psychedelic drug development company. And the role I play there is as a principal investigator. So I'm a contractor for the company in some of their digital psychiatry studies. And the 2 trials I'm involved with, I'm a principal investigator in Quantifying the Effects of Psychotherapy at Scale, which is a study where we're looking at essentially video from mental health sessions with therapists and doctors and patients, which is encrypted at a very high level of encryption and security. And then assessed by machine learning algorithms to, teach them what anxiety looks like, essentially. And it's really a pilot study to determine how we're going to go about getting the scale of data we need to build essentially the heads-up displays for therapists of the future, so that we can take some of what is a really laborious process in terms of training right now, and a bit more hit or miss in delivery. And just like Tesla is rendering the vector space representations of crossing the street or crossing an intersection, our goal with this research is to create the assisted driving, right, for therapists as they cross those emotional intersections. And so they don't crash, right? And the same concepts apply. The other study I'm involved in is the session monitoring system, which is another FDA pathway product where we're taking Spravato, which is S-ketamine, the intranasal form of the drug ketamine, which Janssen, full disclosure, I'm an advisor to Janssen Pharmaceuticals on this product. And basically, we're building out monitoring technology to be able to comply with regulatory monitoring standards in an automated way going forward, which I hope will allow us to scale up the economic feasibility of deploying psychedelic medicine at scale. So it's all basically tech and regulatory around getting these psychedelic medicines, which we are learning are tremendously powerful in terms of effect size, like how big of a difference is it, not just does it work a little bit, which has been the standard medication for years. And the backstory there is their chief medical officer is a longtime friend of mine. And he and I kind of hatched some of these ideas many years ago. And, it turns out they fit perfectly well into the portfolio of things Mind Medicine was interested in. And so it was natural for, after his company, Health Mode, got acquired by Mind Medicine, which is basically a clinical trials machine learning company, to integrate those approaches with psychedelic medicine. And as a psychiatrist, I'm basically interested in one thing: does it work? And does it help my patients and everyone's patients get better? And if it does work, how are we going to get paid for? Because that's a big problem too. Is that a good enough overview?
Absolutely, yeah. And the paid for thing, I'm sure we'll get to that in a little bit. I want to circle back to the quantifying psychotherapy at scale piece because that sounds fantastic. I think one results driven therapy, being able for people to know who are the therapists that actually do well, and not I think word of mouth referrals is obviously a key piece, but actually having something to back up who are the good clinicians versus who maybe aren't as skilled or don't get the results. I think that's something that's lacking in our field. And I think the people who really enjoy doing the work would welcome more of that, because if you're confident in what you do and you get good feedback from people, then you shouldn't be afraid to get something that verifies that or validates that so that people know what the quality level of the service you're offering is. So quantifying psychotherapy at scale, is that just for psychedelics assisted therapy, or is this for all across the board various forms of therapy?
So right now, it's actually all forms of therapy. The implications for the deployment of psychedelic medicines are probably obvious, but the fundamental hypothesis is psychedelic treatments are likely to make therapy more effective, not just during but after, because it helps the brain be more able to change. And so, if you're going to be doing something powerful and you're going to make the therapy afterwards more powerful, wouldn't it be nice if you could drive some of the outcomes in a positive direction by using the same kind of technology we employ in every other aspect of our lives, no matter how trivial? Right? Like there's a suggestion algorithm on Twitter, and there isn't for your therapist. And here we go. That seems like a thing. Like, is it as important for your therapist to know what he could or should say back, or they could or should say back, and to know what like the tweets you're gonna like? Right? And that's like the
No,
problem with medicine is the delta there between like stuff that's obvious their field of human endeavor, um, and and what we want to do as in healthcare. Those things should be lined up, and that's the idea.
absolutely. And when it comes to the use of psychedelics, I think it seems like the main reasons people are very bullish on that and very excited about it is because obviously it can help more people. It can cut down on the amount of time required for a person to get, to make progress or to get the help they need and go from being in not a great place to being in a much better place. Not to mention what you had just said about post treatment. How long does that for? There's a lot of reasons to be excited. I'm wondering, are there any other things that you're excited about when it comes to the use of psychedelics in the therapy or mental health space, and what, if any, are the risks when it comes to like the use of psychedelics in therapy?
And so like there are kind of two streams of thought which strike me as in conflict. There is the idea that psychedelic medicines are both perfectly safe and unbelievably powerful, and those two things can't be true at the same time. Anything that works is going to work because it does something, and things that do things have risks. And you don't really get, if you want drugs that don't do anything, we'll just take Prozac. Like we got that covered. Relatively low risk and low reward for those drugs, and we know that from the effect size. How big of a change do we see in someone treated with a medication for a condition? And the effect sizes for oral antidepressants drop off dramatically after the first trial. So if one doesn't work for you, the rest are less and less likely to work. And the first one, we measured all these things based on their ability to reduce a rating scale for depression, for example, by half. And so when we say evidence-based medicine, we really mean medicine that's been demonstrated to make people who have one problem on the very first time they try anything 50% less miserable.
So from what I've heard,
so
you can provide some context on this, because from what I've heard, the numbers are pretty staggering in terms of how beneficial the use of psychedelics can be in terms of like what the trials are showing. Like I keep hearing the number 90% effective kind of thrown out there, and I think where my not doubts are, but just questions, because I'm interested. Where my questions lie are in that 10%. So in that 10% of, let's say, people, if it is 10%, might be more, might be less, who do not find it effective. Are there more side effects? Are the side effects more intense? Is there traumatization in any way of these people that don't get results? That kind of thing.
So there are two kinds of problems to worry about here. One is like harm that we do to someone by doing something. And that we refer to as like an error of commission. We did it and it's our fault. And there are also errors of omission. What is the harm you do by not doing something? And none of the things we do in mental health make any sense whatsoever if you forget the fact that mental illnesses are bad, and really bad. The lobotomy won the Nobel Prize. A lobotomy, for those who are young enough to not know what that is, was the Nobel Prize winning interventional approach of sticking an ice pick into your brain through the thin bone behind your eye and wiggling it around so it destroyed the white matter connections between your orbital prefrontal cortex and the rest of your brain. And that won a goddamn Nobel Prize. Now, my argument is, given that was 1926, it was invented, Dr. Antonio Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurosurgeon, was the winner there. And it's one of 3 Nobel Prizes we have in psychiatry. And the only interventions are that and the malarial cure for insanity, where we gave people malaria, which the fever from it killed the syphilis that they had that was actually making them bonkers. Those are both interventional treatments with obviously horrible side effects, and they sound utterly barbaric, and were. But if you forget that the suffering we were trying to address is, for some people, unbelievably disabling, then none of this makes sense. Why would you do any of the things that we do if the suffering wasn't bad? So the risks of letting suffering continue unabated, like do they just keeps going on and you're going to suffer forever? That's bad. And so I like to approach the risks of doing something mindful of the risks of not doing anything at all, which doesn't mean psychedelics are safe. Psychedelic medicines are safe or not safe. It just means that we're trying to address serious problems. And I think that requires a degree of seriousness. Any extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. We've been sold over and over again snake oil for a long time. And anyone saying these things are just the most effective things ever, jumping up and down. Like proving it's going to be really important to the standards of science. But before we say effective, we have to think about what effective means. John, do you have a question?
Yeah, no, I'm just kind of curious. I mean, I've done this is a facet of, or a category that I'm really particularly fascinated. I have people who have had experience with this and swear by it, and Jotham, same thing. It sounds like the efficacy of this is towards the like 90%. Wonder and worry about that 10%. I didn't know that lobotomies won a Nobel Peace Prize. That's a fun fact I'll carry with me.
Nobel Prize medicine, not just
Medicine,
peace.
sorry,
This is
right?
a
No,
bullshit.
right. Of medicine, right?
Medicine prize is real.
Sticking an ice pick in your eye is winning prizes like that is quite interesting. I think one thing that might be helpful too, when I started doing more things and trying to like have conversations with this, of like people having a hard time understanding that it's we're not giving dosage of psychedelics that are going to cause people to trip or to to quote unquote, or to hallucinate, or to things like that. Can you speak a little bit more to like the medical dosing of what this would look like and the implications of that? Because I think that's one of the biggest pushbacks. And like when I have this conversation with people, people try to relate it to like the marijuana push. It was legal, it was illegal, and it was demonized, and it was this terrible, terrible thing. And it's just been lost towards legalization. And people try to have the same type of conversation on psychedelics, and it doesn't seem to fit for me. And that one of the biggest things that comes up is like, well, why are we giving people to, trip on acid or trip on psychedelics or, all these different things we did in the 60s with the CIA, and that was terrible. And it's like, well, it's not the same type of process. Could you speak a little bit more to like what that would look like in terms of treatment for individuals to provide some context?
Sure. I'll start with what I know, which is ketamine and esketamine, because those are both legal and approved. And they're not traditional psychedelics. They're actually dissociative anesthetics or derivatives thereof. But I think given this is a sports-themed podcast, I'll use a sports metaphor, which I rarely do because I'm not very sporty. But like baseball, 0.3 RBI is not bad. 0.5 would be like the all-time, if I'm understanding our RBI right. Is that about right?
You got it.
I would say that's about right.
Yep.
Yeah. And so psychedelic medicine is to traditional antidepressants what a 0.8 RBI would be to baseball.
Wow. Okay.
Love it. It's a great way to put it.
So, like, how big of a difference is it matters? Like, are you gonna how far out on a limb are you gonna go? How much effort are you gonna put in to make sure that you get the 0.8 RBI hitter compared to a bunch of 0.35s or 0.31s or 0.2s?
Right, and that seems to be the process, especially with antidepressants. It won't work for the first couple of weeks, and then you might see some growth, and then it doesn't work anymore, and then you switch, and then you switch, and then you switch. And what we know is that the probabilities that they are effective go down dramatically as the further out that you go. And so this conversation is extremely helpful, just as providing that there are methods that are being researched now to provide a better system. Because I think that in my work, I see that a lot of people who are struggling with depression, and they're bouncing between different depressants, and that obviously can provide a little bit of a hard scenario for the person to be managing. Like, well, I'm coming down off these meds and that doesn't feel great, and I'm coming back up on these meds and that doesn't feel great. And there's a lot of discouragement that goes into just trusting that as a process in general. So this is a good conversation for us to have.
I mean, it is, and I think that the coach needs to know who to put in the game, right? If you have on the bench the dude with the 0.3 RBI average and the dude with the 0.8, and it's an important game, well, you got to put your best players at bat. And we don't do that in psychiatry. We treat every other field of medicine differently. We use, even if the 0.8 RBI guy is a jerk, you're still going to put him at bat because he's knocking out of the park.
Sure.
And that's what matters in that case. Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to reiterate. So since we're doing this podcast live, we are going to leave some time at the end for a Q&A. For now, we're going to finish this interview portion, and then we're going to have people speak in case they want to request at that time, which will probably be around 3:45, maybe closer to in between 3:45 and 4. So I did have a follow-up question on that because it relates to what John had mentioned in terms of, so when you're using psychedelics in therapy, are there certain people who are candidates more for, let's say, maybe like the microdosing side of things versus other people who are looking for, a psychedelic assisted therapy where they may have a session when they are given enough to actually have a hallucinogenic experience, but guided by a therapist, and who would be candidates for either? Or how do you decide which fork in the road to go down?
Yep. So I'll start again with a metaphor. There's the difference between having a really nice cold glass of water at a restaurant and having normal saline pumped into your veins in a surgical OR. It's both water, right? The salt mix is a little different, but the context matters because it's not trivial to have or not have normal saline when you're getting surgery. And, could you do without that glass of water at lunch? Yeah, probably. So the context for psychedelic medicine is different from the context for psychedelic ritual and spiritual uses. And many people could take a compound which induces a psychedelic experience and have an experience that's, either positive or negative, but that's different from its use in people who have serious medical conditions. It's likely to do different stuff, work differently. There's different underlying biology, maybe, depending on people going through the ritual. But I'm not in the business of, fighting with shamans. Shamans do shaman work. I am not a shaman. I am a doctor. I know about doctor things. I'm not in the business of regulating and or telling shamans what to do. That is their business. But I think the flip side should also be true, that shamans shouldn't be doing medicine because they're not trained to do it and it's not their experience, which doesn't mean there aren't a place for both of those things. If I couldn't have a glass of water on the regular throughout the day, it'd be a problem, but it's not the same as having it pumped into me through an IV because I have massive blood loss.
Yeah, and people that call themselves shamans, I would say that's probably one area that could stand to get more regulated. I would guess that's part of the risks of this area lie, because if you have someone that's calling themselves that, but how do we know that they are? There's a lot more risks involved with that. And you mentioned something interesting, Dr. Owen, where you said you made a comparison in terms of like how one person's brain may react to the use of these things versus someone else's. That kind of reminds me of, like, say it's similar to ADHD, where someone without ADHD, if they're put on a stimulant, is going to react very, very differently when compared to someone who does have ADHD, is put on a stimulant, in terms of, let's say someone without ADHD would have sort of an upper effect, right? Sort of like a ton of caffeine, maybe hyper, endless energy, versus someone with ADHD, their brain is actually going to get quite focused and calm down. Was that an accurate comparison?
I think it's an accurate comparison. So, I mean, if we take, as true that there is different underlying biology in people, and when we give them compounds that can influence how their brains react, the underlying biology matters for the outcome. If that is true, then we have to be careful with who we give what to. And that's the very simple thing I'm saying.
So what would the process be for, and I think Jonathan touched on this a little bit, but what would the process be for like finding the ideal client, right? So,
Yep.
For us, right, like I'll just continue with the ADHD piece, right? Like we've got assessments, we've got diagnostic criteria, we've got measures to sort of get us as close as possible to getting an accurate diagnosis of ADHD, to be able to have an informed decision of saying like, yes, this is a person that fits the category, has the diagnosis, and would benefit from medication. What does that look like in your world in terms of like, is this person going to respond well to this treatment?
And so this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Because we need to know a couple things. One, who's going to respond well. Two, who's not. And how do we tell the difference between those things? And to get that information, we need to both have, rigorous randomized controlled trials, which are harder to do with psychedelic medicines because they're harder to blind or to preserve the blind so that you basically don't know who got what, which is the standard of care or the standard of research evidence that we use, which is not necessarily the best, but it is what we consider the gold standard in research. And comparing that to once we know this thing is a thing that works, well, in whom does it work and for what? And those are what we call effectiveness questions. Like in the real world, when we take this out of the very small population of people with just one problem, depression, and we give them just one thing, psilocybin, and we do it in a really controlled way, and they get psychotherapy of a very specific sort afterwards. What happens then? Okay, what happens if you give that to someone who didn't have quite the same problems that everyone in the study did, and maybe they're going to miss a couple doses, and maybe they can't afford the therapy, or the therapist just isn't really doing the right, okay, so we can see there are lots of problems that could occur in translating a remarkable finding in a clinical laboratory setting and a research study to the real world. And so part of the work I'm doing with Mind Medicine is to help standardize the real world and provide expert guidance without having to have endless experts. And the work Carlene, my wife, Carlene Nolan, does at Osmind, which is a EHR health tech company, essentially. I'm probably not saying that on brand, but I don't work there, so whatever. What Osmind is doing is collecting real world evidence. So we know what happens when these things are released into the wild, as it were, and they're being prescribed for all sorts of conditions. And we follow what happens with everybody. So we can know not just in the research study, but across the broader population, what actually happens for reals when we do this. And they did that recently with a study called OKRA, OKRA, which was the largest study on intravenous ketamine as a treatment, not necessarily including psychotherapy afterwards, in the real world. And we know some things from that we didn't before. Like if you have treatment-resistant depression, you're going to need a couple of trials or a couple of treatment courses of ketamine over the course of a year. But, it's about 3 on average. But after that's done, as far as we know, that creates sustained effects and sustained changes. And that's a huge deal for the field. So thank you, real world evidence, and what actually happens to many, many people, not just the carefully curated subjects of research studies. And so we need to do that kind of work and build the kind of technology to collect the answers from all of us in a systematic way so that people, like you and me, can have some idea what to say when somebody comes in and they got an ACL tear and they can't play this season and it's destroying them. And what's going to be helpful for them. And we're not going to know that necessarily from strictly controlled research studies yet. It's just going to give us a guidepost.
Well, I'm glad you brought it there because we're going to get into Web3 a little bit in terms of the overlap between mental health and Web3. We'll also probably get a few other questions regarding mental health, regarding mentalization-based treatment, because I know you focus on some of your work on that. But I want to kick it to John because you just kind of overlap the whole athlete injury piece. And I'd love, John, if you have any questions for Dr. Owen regarding that overlap in terms of whether it's his work or what he thinks about athlete injuries as it relates to mental health and or medication use, feel free to go right ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to kind of ask a few questions and then sit back and learn. I think I do a ton of work with athletes. That's sort of like my niche of work, and I work from just the full spectrum, from professional athletes, professional teams, and then all the way down to elementary and middle school kids. I know we're not talking about elementary and middle school kids when we're talking about psychedelics necessarily, but one of the things that I hear a lot of, and that I deal with a lot of, is the injury component of athletics. And I think that for most athletes, injury is something that they can identify with. And I was an athlete through college and got injured, and like physical injury was probably repairable, but my mental injury wasn't, and it cost me that sort of continued career. And so I sort of refer to it as like almost sports induced depression, right? So my world got taken from me, and I spiraled. And I see that a lot with athletes now, where identity's wrapped up in performance and they can't separate the two. Especially, they lose the endorphin hits, they lose the structure, they lose like basically everything, the support networks. And I'm just kind of curious to hear like what systems or what procedures or what methodologies you utilize with working with injured athletes, and just kind of curious to hear how the intersectionality between psychedelic treatment potentially and injury could be beneficial. I know with psilocybin and like CTE and stuff like that, I know that there's been some research done in that, which is pretty powerful and pretty cool. And I know Carcillo has been a big proponent of that, an NHL player, and talks a lot about that. So I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts. I know it's a super general and vague, but I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts about like how the intersectionality of psychedelics and injury recovery and treatment would look.
Yeah, and so this is where, psychiatrists or doctors, and that matters for this particular problem, right? So I went to medical school, which is not true of psychologists and not true of social workers generally, though they may go do that later and become physicians.
Definitely didn't go to medical school.
Well, one of my
Nope.
one of my teachers, as a doctor, was a social worker for years first, and so she ended up doing both. But part of the point of that is like I did surgery as part of my training. I functioned as an internal medicine doctor for many months of my life, and as a neurologist, and as a even in medical school and surgical teams with trauma surgery. And so there's a lot of stuff we learned that has most of the day nothing to do with what we're doing, but every once in a while it really matters. And so I've said, for example, I do a lot of screening around sports injuries because it turns out they can be highly correlated with rheumatological conditions, and those are highly correlated with psychiatric conditions, because I suspect the same underlying autoimmune causes of plantar fasciitis and tennis elbow being more common are related to the causes, the basic biology of depression, etc. And when you're thinking about like, well, what's bad about a physical injury? What makes it bad for your life? Well, it hurts, right? And it restricts your movement, and it also challenges your sense of self when the things that kept you together are taken away because they wouldn't be safe or even possible anymore. And being able to, have treatments that kind of give you a twofer as it were, is pretty cool. And so when we look at things like ketamine, that's a treatment that's been used for years. And we know, and you said, well, probably not in kids. Well, actually, we have more safety data on the use of ketamine in children than we do most psychiatric medications, because we've been using it in anesthesia for 30 years, and we've given it to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children. So
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's great.
And if you look at the risk profile of something like Prozac or Risperdal or whatever, there are black box warnings on these things from the FDA, which isn't to say they're like super dangerous, but they're not safe in the same way we generally mean safe. It's like, are they tolerable risks? Well, that's for you and your doctor to decide. But if you're comparing the risks of something, blah blah blah, you want to see what it's going to do, and sometimes side effects are also effects we want. And so in the case of something like ketamine and perhaps psilocybin, the altering of pain signaling may mean that not only is it going to be useful for your mood, for things like getting you up and about and walking sooner after a knee repair. And that prompt mobility and mobilization changes the game in terms of your recovery, and leads to better outcomes. And it's the ability to do those two things at once, and probably better than opiate medications, for example. That may make it a real huge win for injured athletes.
Well, I'm really happy that you bring up the opiate piece too, because we've obviously seen how that's gone. And do you see this as a substitute addition to, obviously I think there is room for opiates when done appropriately. Potentially, again, I'm speaking out of my realm. This is all you, but I've seen it work for people when it's been done in an appropriate way. Is this sort of a wave that will supersede that? I know that injuries, especially in pro sports, and I would say that certain sports are worse than others. Hockey to be one of them. Like, give them a shot and get them back on the ice, and give them some pain meds and hope that they're okay. Do you see the trajectory of the research you're doing and the strategies that you're using as something that will be like substituting completely what exists already?
I mean, we still do a lot of things in medicine that have been around for a long time, and we tend to have respect for things that have a long track record. And also, that's not always the right way to do it, right? And this is why we need real world evidence at scale to know what we should do. But practically, like, if you got surgery for your knee, it's on average better to be up and walking around than not. And there are different ways of dealing with that. And so one example, which isn't psychedelic medicine per se, but it's neuromodulatory, which means it changes how the brain works, is some of the transcranial magnetic stimulation work I do, where we can target a part of the cortex that is mapping onto your knee. And we can do a treatment that facilitates the firing of the neurons that gate pain in that specific part of the body. And so with no medicine at all, if your knee hurts, I can target that part of your body, give that treatment a shot, give that treatment kind of multiple days in a row, and basically jazz up your brain's ability to shut down pain in your knee without any medicine at all.
And does that present, obviously pain signals to the brain are indications that something might be like wrong. And so shutting down the capacity for that to occur, does that, in your experience, having done this before, what would be the utilization of doing something like that? If someone like in excruciating pain and being able to shut that down enough so that, you can give time just back to them so they're not in significant
Right.
amount of pain. Is that the primary purpose, or would it, or how would you implement that? Or I guess, how would you screen for someone who would be appropriate for that type of a treatment?
And so, the question is, like, pain does something and it's there for a reason. But if it's getting in the way of you doing the rehab you need to do to get better, that's probably not helping. And if you need to mobilize but can't because pain, then helping the pain helps you mobilize, which helps reduce the pain. Right.
I see. So you're capable of the movement. You're not putting yourself into additional risk, but the pain itself is restricting you from getting better. That would be a candidate that would fit this type of a treatment.
For example, but I hope you can see at least that, like, with the enough medical knowledge of a vague enough knowledge of what other doctors are doing, and some specific knowledge of what you're supposed to be doing on the team. And that includes, the therapists working together. Like, what's possible? What should we be doing in therapy? What are the goals we're moving towards? And they're going to be different for people from different cultures and with different experiences. And I think sports is a culture that requires competence in that culture. Like, I'm not a baseball player. This is probably the first time this year I've referred to RBI at all. But you know what? Like, it's the one thing I can remember about baseball, and so I brought it up for this podcast because
just run with it. Yep, absolutely.
Right, it's going to get me. It's going to be more relatable to the audience because, like, why would I do otherwise, right? And similarly, like, you have to know a little bit about this and a little bit about that, and enough to,
I think we lost you there for a second, Dr. Owen, but it's funny because you bring up the RBI analogy or metaphor. And I think, fantastic metaphor. I would guess the analytics, the stat heads would get mad at you for that because they don't care about RBIs anymore. I guess that that no longer matters. They're all about
stats.
Yeah, exactly. They're all about swing lane and stuff that I don't wrap my head around. But
I'm losing Moneyball.
Exactly. Billy Bean would not be happy with you, Dr. Owen. So I have a follow-up question because I love the description of mentalization-based treatment. Fascinates me because I know I've read some stuff. I'm not an expert in the area you're an expert in, so I'm new to this stuff. I'm trying to read more about how over the next 10 years, some people predict that mapping the mind, mapping the brain is going to be something that unlocks a lot of potential for helping people and understanding the complexity of emotions and how that ties into mental health and everyday functioning. And so my question is, while mental health awareness seems to be going up and mental health stigma associated with getting services and getting help going down, both great things, the mental health numbers and suicide numbers especially are still heading in the direction. And this was happening before COVID. I think COVID has only compounded things. And my question to you is why? Like, why do you think things are trending in that direction still? And what do you think we can do to stop it?
Oh God. Yeah.
That was a 99-mile-an-hour fastball, high and tight right there.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, so the things I have to say here are actually pretty provocative. In that I think the fundamental problem is that, like, a lot of the world depends on innovation in the US and deployment of capital in the US. And I think the deployment of capital in the United States as it relates to mental health is both deeply misguided, not as valuable as it could be, and in some cases, frankly, unethical. Because it diverts skill, talent, training, experience, tremendous social investments that, by the way, taxpayers pay for. Every residency training spot, or almost all of them, is paid for by Medicare. And given that, taking doctors and having them do stuff that's stupid or addresses non-problems or the wrong problems is both not fair. Like, ethics is always in tension, right? There's always a tension between ethical principles, justice, non-maleficence, aka not doing something wrong, beneficence, aka doing a good thing, and autonomy, respecting people's individual rights. So when someone says ethics and they say that's unethical, well, what every ethical conversation should be is there is a conflict in which ethics we are prioritizing here. And so I think there is an over prioritization of justice, aka making something accessible, compared to beneficence, doing a good thing, or non-maleficence, not doing bad things. And so by endlessly respecting justice and autonomy, by trying to make it cheaper and freer for everybody, at least theoretically, at the expense of doing the right thing or not doing the wrong thing, the pendulum can swing too far in the wrong direction. And I will make this very concrete. I think what we've seen in the Wall Street Journal recently about companies like Cerebral and Dunn around ADHD treatment, and I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist in addition to adult psychiatry, treating ADHD is important, and it can be life-changing. But when we have nurse practitioners telling us in the Wall Street Journal that they write 2 prescriptions a minute for $10 a prescription all day long, it seems like something may have gone off the rails. And we didn't like what happened when we did that with opiates, and we will similarly not like what's going to happen when we do that with stimulants, and I imagine we'll be similarly unhappy when we do that with other controlled substances like psychedelics as well. So be careful what you wish for, and be careful what you spend money on. And I think the reason we're not making an impact in mental health is because we are endlessly throwing money at platforms to get market share, but not change outcomes. We're not prioritizing paying or training professionals who have to bear the burden of this work. They're treated like cattle at best, like heads of cattle, and they're there to do a kind of a thing which isn't what we're actually trained to do generally, which is do what is really complex work. And so I'm more interested in building tools to help that complex work be better and be more scalable than I am at paying therapists as little as is humanly possible so they can text with 20 people at once, like we were trying to make money on Poker Stars, which, by the way, got indicted by the goddamn government. So it brought us damage. So you got to be careful what you invest in. Investors, note, right? Because there are problems that happen when you take tons of highly trained people and make them do stuff that you think is a good idea, and you've never gone to medical school, and you have no effing idea what you're really dealing with.
I love that you brought it there, because I think, money, there's no shortage of money being in general, let alone being invested in the mental health space. I think we've definitely seen that over the last 5 years. I always sort of speak, with caution to people about where mental health is going, because it seems like there's a lot of people that see it now that the stigma being reduced and health awareness going up, both great things. I think it's also opened the door to a lot of sharks, a lot of people with money who want to capitalize on that. And you definitely see that happening from a startup perspective. And like you said, they really don't focus on training clinicians, paying clinicians the right amount and training them in the right ways so that they do good work and they're happy. And I think one thing I'm very worried about moving forward is the collective mental health of clinicians, of practitioners in this across the mental health field, because they've had to go through the last 2 or 3 years of COVID and be there to support other people. But what happens, there's already a shortage of good mental health clinicians. What happens if the good ones get burnt out? And I think this relates to my question for you about Web3, because I think one of my concerns is that the Web3 landscape has so much potential when it comes to helping people and the topic of mental health. But what if if the people in that landscape just do the same thing, throw a bunch of money in and try to create innovative things, but are really not focused on training the right people and train them in the right ways? So my question to you is, where do you hope to see this overlap of Web3 and mental health go? And is that where you think or predict it will go?
Well, I hope it goes to my budget.
Fair.
Kidding, not kidding. I have been thinking about this a lot, and I think what we do on Twitter Spaces, for example, or what I did on Clubhouse with our Ask Me Anything shows, or the Frontier Psychiatry show, was really important work. If you can reach 10,000 people in the course of 2 hours about with really good medical information about PTSD or ADHD or whatever it happens to be, and they can get unbelievable information compared to what you can just access willy-nilly, have your questions directly answered by someone who otherwise would be thousands of dollars an hour and never talk to you. That's a huge deal. And that's just the first use case without even bringing it to actual care. And so do I think there's a potential to do something scalable that's really important and really valuable all at once? Yes. And I want to be very clear. I'm not hating on industry. I love industry. If it wasn't for industry, we'd have nothing to do our jobs with. We'd have no tools, no treatments, no innovation. It'd just be a bunch of people going, yeah, no, this seems like a problem. I'm gonna get back to you on that. Right? We need industry. The incentives that they're working with are what's wrong. And I do not blame the founders of these companies for building great businesses for bad incentive. I do think it's incumbent on us to make sure, to the degree possible, as founders or founding companies that address meaningful problems, if that's the business you're in. And if you're not, get the F out of healthcare. There are plenty of other platform as a service things you could do with your time, like go make car rental easier or something. I don't know, but get the F out of my backyard. This is not a place for you. Go make money doing something else, because there are plenty of other things where this doesn't matter as much. Like if you fuck up car rental markets, we're not going to die. The same is not true for psychiatry and for healthcare.
So
But
how, I'm
yeah,
curious too. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Finish your thought.
I don't want them. I don't want it to sound like I'm blaming them for doing something wrong. I think they're responding to the market they see in front of them, and in some cases, adapting remarkably to those market conditions. But it doesn't mean they are doing the best possible thing. And if you're going to pour your life into being a founder, or pour money into a startup, you should have a good sense of why it's doing what it's doing and what the outcomes are likely to be. And I think there's, with great power comes great responsibility, and wielding that in ways that are unhealthy and unhelpful. There's more room for if you're disrupting cabs like Uber, and there's less room for it if you're disrupting people's lives and how disrupted they already are from our unbelievably bad healthcare system.
So what are some ideas of how do we keep this protected? I think we should have lots of conversations around this, that like in our culture we tend to pendulum swing and really dramatically, and rather than sort of finding the medium balance of like what's best in both what are the best parts of both sides, we have a tendency to not listen to the middle. We just end up on one side until it doesn't work anymore, and then we go to the other side until it doesn't work anymore, and then back and forth, and we get sort of stuck in this loop. What are things you think would be helpful of like how do we protect this industry, because it is growing, and I think it's beneficial that the stigma is declining and people are accessing more care, but to what we've been talking about, it does bring the sharks to water, and you understand that they can make business, and I absolutely agree that the incentives are wrong. These companies are made to create money, not to service and help people, and that needs to be the foundation of why we are doing the work, is to help people. How do you see us being able to, either systematically or just approach of keeping those types of organizations sort of, and I think I don't want to sit up here on a high horse saying that those systems,
Yes.
those platforms don't help people, because they certainly do. But being knowing what it's like, the life of a clinician, sitting behind my phone, texting with 20 sad people a day, I know I'm not giving the best service. I just, for myself personally. So
Yeah.
how do we help keep the industry protected, I guess?
I'm going to push back real hard. If we're not making money, we're not taking our jobs seriously. As innovators, as founders, as team members, or as clinicians. If we can't compete in the market, we have give up. Or go do
Right.
something.
Yeah, that I agree with. I think, because like you said, that we can actually go to battle with some of these things, but it can't be in my opinion, the sole incentive to be making money. In my opinion, especially in this business, the sole incentive should be to help and support people. Obviously, making money as a business is vital to be able to do that. I guess I'm just
But
mostly
I want
curious
to
of.
back you off that, because when people say, "Yeah, no, it can't be just about making money," no. I would argue that here's the potential in Web3. We have the participation of people like you and Jotham, and maybe me. We have so many more clinicians, therapists, even psychiatrists who are involved members of this community. And if people are interested in building, healthcare services using Web3 infrastructure, involve people who know what they're doing. Because I will not back down from the hypothesis that, clinician-driven insights into what's a good idea combined with market insights into what's possible makes more money, not less money. And if you're making less money, you're doing it wrong. It means your market insight is wrong. And so I don't think it's about saying, well, you shouldn't just be making money. No, you should be making more money. If you're doing it right and you're including actual understanding of what gets people well, and you're basing your business on making money when people get well, you're going to make, if you do it right, more money. And that's a more responsible and fiduciary role for companies, for shareholders, for founders, for investors. We have to be working with aligned incentives, and it can't be sacrificing profits for less clinical quality. It needs to be harnessing quality for more profits at the end.
I love that. Yeah, I think
you
if you
can't figure out how to make more money doing a better job, get the F out of my backyard.
exactly, I think ideally it's both, right? You're helping the most people, and you're making money, and making money is a reflection on how many people you're able to really serve in that way. And I think combining, you mentioned something that was really key, combining clinician-driven insights and market analysis at the same time. Totally agree with that. I think it's a fantastic way to put it, and that is the best balance. I'm sure it is a hard balance to find, But I agree that the combination of those things is really key. So we're getting to the end of the hour here. So I want to make sure we give some time back to all the people that tuned in and want to ask a question to Dr. Owen as part of our Q&A. So I will wrap up and land this plane, the podcast plane, so to speak, and then we will kick it to the Q&A for people to ask questions, come up and speak and ask questions. The Q&A portion will be edited out, so it will not be on the podcast episode that goes onto the platform. That way, in case people want to ask questions, but they don't want to be recorded or added onto the episode, they won't be. So we will wrap up now. We want to remind everyone that all the helpful information about Dr. Owen and links that we describe in this episode can be found in the show notes and on our website at grimdrive.com. I want to encourage everyone to follow Dr. Owen on Twitter. It's at Owen Muir MD, M-U-I-R, at Owen Muir MD, as well as myself at Jotham, L-I-C-S-W, and John is at Riser and Tread. So we want to encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Grim Drive podcast for our interview Dr. Owen Muir. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but we encourage people to follow us on Twitter, where we're going to host several Twitter spaces. We do one for the Astromojis NFT community called Coaching Zone. John and I do that, where we're doing that Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And another one that I sometimes co-host in Psychedelics Anonymous NFT community called PA Sports Talk, which is kind of a light, sports banter sort of spaces that we bi-weekly on Monday nights from 5 to 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The next one's on April 11th and then April 25th and bi-weekly from there. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in for this episode, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.